And welcome back to Powers to the People. A little Hugo Montenegro, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that's kind of what we're talking about today. The good, the bad, and the ugly in the world. And we're joined by Richard Lynn, who is an analyst with the Department of Homeland Security. And we're talking about America's place in the world. And now we find ourselves not in a bipolar world, but in a multipolar world where there are threats all over the world, not just from the Soviet Union. We don't have two superpowers. Now we have many more powers that are emerging in the world. China lifting its ugly head again. And back to Richard, we kind of were talking about, before we went to the break there, Richard, about how economics in this country actually are going to really be the defining, I think, the defining issue as to how America maintains its standing in the world. If we don't get our government spending under control, if we don't get our economy under control with all these entitlement programs, and you mentioned Marco Rubio in his speech that he gave at the Reagan Library. We played part of that speech on the program the day after he did it, and he actually mentioned that point in the part that we played, that no country could sustain the entitlements, and that's what happens with a lot of capitalist countries. It shouldn't happen with our country because we're a federalist state, unlike many other democracies that are just democracies. We're supposed to have a federalist system in this country, and we have gotten away from that. And now all of the power seems to lie in Washington, D.C. and not in the states, and we see now that we're building this huge federal bureaucracy that is overtaking our economy.
Right. Yeah, well, I think one thing, especially in this day and age, you do find that nations are really dependent not just on hard power but soft power. You really need a combination of both to succeed right now and to stay competitive. One thing I do think, though, it's important to temper what's going on in our country with what goes on in other countries. And there are a lot of things that are going on in our country that aren't really, true to our values and at the level that we once were. You look back during, in the 60s when 2/3 of our budget was defense and 1/3 of it was entitlement spending. And then all that changed, as a growth of government, and you look at the things that were put in during the Great Society and added on after that, and you find that so many things have changed, and that the American creed has really kind of been hijacked, in a sense, by those who, have more faith in the state than they do in individuals. And that was one of the great things that defined our country as opposed to other countries, belief in the ability of the individual, and because of the ability that he's been given to by God. So I really do think that a lot of the answer and how we confront these go back to those values.
Well, and you mentioned that back in the 60s, in the early 60s, when Eisenhower was president, the military budget, as you said, was like 2/3 of the budget. That's what the government is supposed to do, is to protect us from all enemies, foreign and domestic, and also to do things like build our infrastructure, run our court system, and
right.
and of course the states and local governments provide our police protection, and back then they provided our education. Now we have the federal government doing all those other things, and also now have created, as you said, under the Great Society and under Lyndon Johnson and others, they have just grown this huge entitlement complex that is eating up our economy, and it is destroying our ability to actually invest in the things that the government's supposed to be investing in. And the president now is calling for more infrastructure, but that's what we should have been doing all along, rather than having the government control our education system, control our health care system, control every aspect of our lives with regulations that have destroyed businesses and have kept businesses from creating jobs. But I want to get back to a point that you were making, though, when you said that we were eaten up with actually the military was 2/3 of our budget. Demetrius had a question for you on that very subject.
Richard, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
for having me.
President Eisenhower warned about the United States becoming too much of a industrial military complex. We're talking about the Cold War. During the period of the Cold War, we saw the Vietnam War, the Korean conflict, the Berlin blockade, and you saw military powers and
Cuban Missile Crisis.
I forgot that one.
Right.
And during the 80s, our military power expanded. Recently, we know the conflict in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And this question is kind of difficult because I come from a military family. My father was never involved with war, but I'm a military brat, and I'm starting to support the military. Are we too much of a military complex? And if we are, is it too late to retrieve?
That's an excellent question. I think that a lot of times, especially since our generation just grew up with the understanding that standing militaries were common. For up until the Cold War, there was a very strong ideological current within the United States that standing militaries essentially were symbols of tyranny because, quite frankly, for most of world history, they were. They were tools of empires. And rather than protecting the people, they served the state. And so... And oftentimes, they were the principal tools by which liberty was subverted. Whole peoples were subjugated, and so the American, ideology was for pretty much the first century and a half of its existence was pretty much pitted against the idea of a standing army. When you had an army. And there's kind of a romantic idea of a Minuteman or a citizen soldier, which wasn't always the best way to fight a war, but it was basically more consistent with American values. I think the Cold War was a dramatic departure from that because during previous wars you had the citizens rise up, and then afterwards, they might have had somewhat of an army, but then. During a war, the mobilization would really kick in, and then after a war, you generally demobilize, generally speaking. Not to say you completely dismantle the military, but generally that's what happened. Cold War was the first time where, during a peacetime era where there was no hot war, we essentially just had a standing military that kept growing and growing, and we were spending as if we were in war. The Cold War was extremely expensive. The estimates are anywhere between $6 to $13 trillion spent by the United States. Those are old figures from the 90s, but essentially it's just a massive amount of money, and they covered a great deal of areas in the nation's life. I mean, it was a cultural thing. It was an we educated our students so we could be smarter than the Soviets. We went to space so we could beat the Soviets. We built planes so they could shoot down Soviet planes. We produced, we made alliances so that we would have more allies than the Soviets. Everything. It was a comprehensive effort. And you asked whether is that kind of a threat to liberty. Well, I think that's a very good question because it is a legitimate question in light of American values that had always been pitted against the idea of standing armies. But I think you find that as the world just gets more dangerous, as there was no threat in history the way there was when it came to the Soviet Union. A nation that for many years were led by Stalin, and you essentially had an expansionist nation that had the power of nuclear weapons and the ability to impose its will upon its neighbors and the world. And so I think that in that sense, yes, you do give something up when you're creating a big military, namely money and other opportunity costs. But at the same time, the greater threat was this Soviet menace, which in many ways was the greater of the evils.
Well, I agree 100%. I think Reagan did the right thing with expanding our military at a time when we had to defeat that enemy, even though it was done without firing a shot. He certainly knew what he was doing because it did enable us to then move back to where we didn't have to spend so much on military. But of course, you always have the situation where once you have a big military and a big military industrial complex, the temptation is to use it. Can you stick around with us one more time? Because I want to talk about that when we come back.
Sure.
All right, we'll be back with Richard Lynn.
Cheap.